Right, we'll shut this door.
Before we kill the lights,
Oh yes.
I've got a magic trick to do.
Hold on everybody. Pay attention now.
Do you remember I said it's getting easier to conjure things from thin air? I can't remember, I was talking about fleet number plates, I think, wasn't I? I think it is getting easier to conjure things from thin air in bus preservation, and to prove the point, I brought along a box full of thin air. It's definitely thin air, isn't it? Oh, there's another box inside. There's another box inside, which is also full of thin air. Would you prove that it's full of thin air?
My Conjuring ready.
Well, it's not quite full because the inside there's something else. Which I'll hold the box, and I think you'd better complete the conjuring trick to see what we've managed to conjure from thin air. And this trick has never been shown before in public. But there, from thin air, is an original 1540 fleet number plate. There it is. Just to prove that we got the numbers slightly wrong on the ones we remade. It's pool blue, but it is uncleaned from the day it was taken off. It's still got road traffic grime on. I think it's probably the rear one because it's quite badly corroded and they get, all sorts thrown up at them, don't they? But I've got another one from the same series, and if you cut it, it comes up as a lovely pool blue. But this one I've left exactly as it was when I got it. It came to light because somebody was selling a fleet number plate from a sister bus which I bought, and I just happened to say, I don't suppose you've got any more of these, have you? And the answer was, yes, which one? And I thought, well, I'm not going straight in with 1540 because he'll know that I really want it. So I gave him a little list, you see, and 1540 was on the list. And he was eventually persuaded to part with it at a reasonable price. And he did the decent thing. But there you are. You're the first people to see that. Even my dad hasn't seen that yet, so don't tell him. Don't tell him. He's not having it, though. We're going to try and get one 3D printed because, of course, the beauty with Hanson Dorset ones is they're painted so they could be made from anything. So if we can make an exact replica, that's what we'll do. So well done, magician. Thank you to Debbie McGee there. Now, the title of this section was, you remember, Little Distractions. So I'm going to take you on a very brief distraction now to Broadcasting House in London. I mentioned about university. I've been very interested in radio since I was in my early teenage years. And when I was still at school, I started writing letters to Terry Wogan to read out on Wake Up to Wogan on Radio 2, which was his breakfast show. And it was at the time that fax machines had just been invented in domestic terms. And so I started by sending faxes, and then somebody invented something called email. And Paul Walters, who is the chap on the right, who was Terry Wogan's producer, fantastic bloke, used to put my letters on every day at 10 to 9. And of course, as a schoolboy, I'd be in assembly at 10 to 9. So I had to leave a tape recording to see whether Terry had read my letter. So I've now got hours and hours and hours of Wake Up to Wogan. But I decided that actually I'd like to be a radio presenter in years to come, and made contact with them. And they used to invite me in to go and watch the show going out. And my other great radio hero was Ken Bruce, who I got to meet and sat with Ken and watched the shows going out. Now, this is a talk about bus preservation. Why am I showing you pictures of radio people? Well, the answer is that the next time I had my photograph taken with Ken Bruce, it was under very different circumstances. Ken and a couple of other Radio 2 colleagues, it turns out, are great bus fans, and hatched a plan to buy a Routemaster out of service with London Transport, which they did. They formed the Broadcasters Bus Consortium. See what they did there? The Broadcasters Bus Consortium, which of course was never talked about on Radio 2. They decided that they would hire this out for weddings at the weekends, and they needed a transport manager. And at the time, I just started working part-time for the BBC, and they said, well, you've got a bit of time on your hands. Would you go and study to get the CPC and become our traffic manager? So I did. And it was a fantastic period of time because I was, alongside all my own preservation work, and radio work, I was going out on Route Masters and eventually was taught to drive by Ken Bruce. So not everybody can say that. Of course, it wasn't the first time I'd driven a Route Master, as you know, but nonetheless, I've Ken and Steve Madden and Alan Dedicote and Charles Nove to thank for my first go behind the wheel of a bus on the public roads. And I also did a very, very nice line in Father Christmas on our Christmas lights tours. I then moved to doing a late night show in the West Country. That's the Children in Need outing that we did there. You can tell I'm not happy that it's a Gibson rather than a set right. They don't feel the same. Whilst in the West Country, I started to pursue more of this Bristol SU interest that we had. Enough said about that, I think. Bristol SUs were small, lightweight vehicles that were made predominantly for the West Country, although other operators did have them. There are only 181 of them built, and I now own most of them, I think. But this one came to find me. The preservation group that owned it had to dispose of their vehicles quite quickly, and I bought it just as quickly. I didn't tell my dad for a few weeks. It was quite interesting when he found out from Colin Billington, just a chance conversation. But of course, he loves working on the vehicles. We've done all the work on 1540 ourselves. And so when the opportunity came to help me to get this back on the road, he really relished that. And don't they look lovely together? There is something about seeing vehicles of the same type and the same livery en masse together. So a pretty pair of Bristols. It's easy, isn't it? Too easy. This is the bus version of the SUL, and this was the first photograph I ever owned of a bus version. So this is how I knew what they looked like. I did used to go and play in 348 EDV, which was a bus one at North's in Sherburn in Elmet, which was a great dealer, and they had all sorts of things that languished in the yard for a long time. One of them was an SU bus, and it was my favourite because all the steering apparatus had been taken off it, and so you could actually turn the steering wheel as a young boy. Anyway, this was the first photograph I had of one, and it just so happened that this had been preserved. This is at a Sandtoft open day in the mid-80s, and I'd never seen the bus and wondered what had happened to it because it seemed to disappear. And then about 10 years ago, it turned up in a photograph looking like this. So very dilapidated after passing through several hands. This, I think, really just goes to show once the ownership of a preserved bus changes, the whole situation can change very, very quickly. And through a succession of owners that perhaps don't understand it or don't respect it for what it is, things can get into quite a desperate situation. Fortunately, this had a notice in its window, although I can tell you from bitter experience that the phone number is missing a digit. It took me quite some time to get hold of this because it kept appearing on eBay and then disappearing, and eventually I tracked down somebody who'd bought it, and they were going to turn it into a cafe. And it was another situation where they said, when can you come and have a look at it? And I said, I'll see you in an hour. And lo and behold, it was rescued, and it's a very significant SU bus because it was a Minehead one. So it would do the Minehead to Lynmouth route, up and down, up Porlock Hill, down Countisbury Hill, and the other way. It would do that 4 times a day. So the brakes on it are shot, but they'll be all right. They'll be all right on the night. And this was collection day. An SU has never travelled so fast. And there it is, just to prove that we got it home. I've done a lot of mechanical work to it. It doesn't look much different at the moment because I'm saving all the cosmetic things for when I've done the nitty-gritty of getting it back to running properly and safely. But it's 60 years old next year, so there is an incentive to try and get on with it over the winter. And just when you think you've seen the only SU that can fly over a bridge, if you look closely, you'll see in true bus style, there'll be another one along in a minute. There it goes, just there, just there. What could that be, I wonder? Well, it's actually a beautiful, immaculate Bristol SU, which I bought in 2018. That's how I found it. It had been in a What's funny about that? What's funny? It had been in a Cornish quarry for about 18 years. When I first saw it, it actually wasn't too bad. That's how it was on the right. It had been lived in by travellers. It had also had its identity changed, and I've got the photos. I've got photographs which are more or less identical, except for the position of the reg numbers and also the new screws in the plate, so we can identify when that was done. But very sadly, it was vandalised and moved around with a bulldozer. And the yard was about to be cleared, so it was agreed that I would buy it for a small amount of money. And then when I went to collect it, it had turned into a large amount of money. But the lorry was there, so it had to be paid. But there it is, on its way to hopefully a slightly brighter future. At the moment, it's nominally a spares donor, but who knows? In years to come, perhaps in my retirement, then maybe it could be done. But for now, it's under a tarpaulin. I mean, that could be a complete SU under there, couldn't it? It's very motivational, covering up these vehicles. That's the way. And I think one of the things about preservation is that it is about the vehicles, but it's also about the people. And we're at, I think, quite a pivotal point where we're saying goodbye to lots of people who have been really significant in bus preservation, but also in our own lives. And I'd like to just take a moment to tell you about my friend Trevor, who we see there, Trevor Leach, with his wife Shirley. I first wrote to Trevor in 1993 when I got into SUs because he ran the West Yorkshire Information Service, and I knew that West Yorkshire had owned SUs, and so thought we might have a couple of photographs of them. And he wrote back and he said, yes, I have got a few hundred photographs of them, but I've also just bought a West Yorkshire SU, which was an incredible bit of luck, you might think. Now, the person that we have to thank for the survival of that particular West Yorkshire SU is in the room tonight and is about to become one of your trustees. Who could it be? Who could it be? So a familiar photo coming up here of the SU which William Staniforth saved. This is just after, I think, Trevor acquired it because it was actually a consortium of them, the SMA5 Preservation Group. I think this is taken at Acaster Melbis after it had left Sandtoft. But during its time when, William, you kept it at Sandtoft, I gather it had a bit of a reputation for unreliability. And so it was known as Sandtoft Bad. And the blind was set like that for quite some time. But in the ownership of Trevor and his colleagues, and subsequently just Trevor and his wife Shirley, They achieved absolute miracles with it, which is a tribute to their hard work, but also to William's foresight in saving it. And they rallied the vehicle for many, many years, alongside the green one that I now own. Dennis Say, who owned that, and Trevor would agree to be at the same rallies, and they would save each other spaces so that the vehicles could park alongside one another. And that continued for many years. Trevor would very often be my conductor at running days on my SU. And one year he and his wife Shirley said to me in the evening that they were aware that they were getting on a bit, in their words, and Shirley was suffering with her health, and they were concerned that they wouldn't be able to put the bus to good use. So would I consider becoming its next owner? And of course, we'd all love to become the next owner of every bus that we love, but you do have to take these things seriously. So I went away and had a good think, and we made a plan between us of how we were going to handle this. And we decided that it would happen into the future. But within months of that decision, Trevor was very sadly diagnosed with a very aggressive form of cancer, and that accelerated the transfer of the bus, because Trevor wanted to see it in its new home and to know that it was safely entering the next stage of its preservation career. So we picked it up in what seemed like indecent haste, but it actually transpired that within a week or two of us collecting it, Trevor had very sadly died. This is when we picked it up. There was a bird in this building, and Trevor found that keeping the sheet on there kept the bird away from it. Having washed the sheet, I'm not sure that it did, but when Trevor and Shirley owned it, they travelled the country quite prolifically with it, and they would always stay at travel lodges. So we broke our journey back south with it at a travel lodge so that we could send them this photograph of it, continuing in the style to which it had become accustomed. And this photograph was taken days before Trevor died. We gave the bus a good polish up, and he did get to see it undercover and enjoying its new surroundings. I'm not sure it loves being in Devon, because all the buses there are green, of course. So we're hoping that we're going to be able to take it back to West Yorkshire as often as we can on a little holiday each year. At the moment, I'm busy rebuilding the brakes on it, because it's had some persistent brake problems since we've had it, but I think we've got to the bottom of them now. It's a daft thing to say, isn't it? Very daft thing to say. But a lovely bus, and of course, every time we see it, we think of Trevor. And isn't that true of all the vehicles that we associate with people who have left us a beautiful legacy, and one that we want to continue? So that's the Sheppard fleet as it stands now. 1540 has been off the road now for 6 years, not through any lack of love, quite the opposite. During that time, we've been doing a lot of structural work to it. As you know from your involvement with 1577 in particular, the rear end on FLFs suffer quite badly from structural problems and corrosion, and we've put an awful lot of time into really stripping that back and sorting those out. And it's actually not like riding on an FLF at the back now, because you're so used to that movement and all the rattles and the noises, and it's now absolutely tight, which is, I hope, a really good sign for the future. And I hope that gives encouragement to others who are doing the same project. It's time consuming. My dad has done all the work himself, which is absolutely to his credit, but it's a big job and it's worthwhile. It's also been refloored. We've had all the original material made to the original specifications. The window rubber has been changed throughout, and it's been completely repainted inside. When it was a driver trainer, they cut the back out of the cab, which actually was quite handy for us, because when I was little, I could sit there with my legs hanging through and watch how it was being driven. we always had a plan to put that back in, but never really the time to do it. Well, now that Dad is retired, we've done that, and it's really interesting. Once you've made a change like that, you quickly forget that it ever was a problem, and it looks as if it's never not been there. So it's a fantastic job that he's done. We at the moment have a cooling problem with it, which is sadly why it couldn't attend the running day this year. But the Cave Brown Cave radiators are coming out now, and that is the one issue that we need to resolve before it will be back on the road and joining you for our traditional Winchester fun. So there we were in 1991, and there we are at Sandbanks in exactly the same location. And as you can see, the bus hasn't changed a bit. It has actually. The wing's grown back longer, hasn't it? And there are various other improvements, but I'm not sure about the two gentlemen, whoever they are. And I think this is quite a unique hobby that we have in bringing people together. And I really do feel that I've been very, very lucky to have a hobby that has kept me so closely in touch with my dad through hard times and good times and struggles with life and with the buses. There are plenty of those with the buses. We've always been in constant touch, and we've always had some sort of project on the go that's kept us together. And I suppose the other thing that I think is quite unique about bus preservation, possibly also to railways as well, is that when you've had a hobby that has stayed with you for the entire duration of your life, it also keeps you in touch with your younger self and your childhood. And I found that I've spent much of my adulthood actually perpetually fulfilling the dreams that I had back then as a child. Things that you think would never be possible suddenly do become possible. Every weekend you can go and drive a low decker. It's quite an incredible thing, and I think we're all very lucky that we have an interest that allows us to do that. Before we just look at the future, in that vein, this all started because we like watching on the buses, and this is a picture of 1540 and about 2004. I just started working for the BBC at that point, so 2004. You can't really see it, but there's a hand on the pole there, and that hand belongs to somebody you might recognise. And this was an LWT documentary on saucy comedy. It was something like that. They branded it that with a very kind of damning, overloaded title. But they wanted to cover on the buses, and to give them their full credit, they had really researched this, and they knew that they needed to find a green low decker. And Brian Izzard, who had been the director of the On the Buses series, knew of ours and put them in touch. And we went to Exmouth and met Reg Varney, who was as wonderful as you might hope he would be. At this stage, he was well into his 90s and very frail, but still took time to talk to us, and we were able to tell him about what he'd inspired. And of course, a really emotive moment to see Reg Varney, the inspiration for all of this, wearing my dad's jacket and my Stan Butler hat. And we think it was the last time he was on a green low decker, so we really felt that was a fitting thing for all of us. So let's hop into the future. We're going to spend half an hour in the future, if that's all right. I'll try and canter through. We are, I think, at a really interesting point in the history of bus preservation. We are at a stage where the national collection, if you think of it in those terms, all the vehicles that have been saved for posterity, is bigger than it has ever been. 10,000 preserved vehicles in the UK, buses and coaches. Each one of them has been saved for subjective reasons mostly. They're somebody's favourite, it's the bus they went to school on, it represents something to somebody. There are various types of ownership, private ownership, museums and collections, and also operators who are keeping a vintage fleet. And we've got, I think, quite a few challenges facing us. And this isn't meant to sound negative. I think this is actually just from somebody who's been involved for a long time. These are things that I sense bus preservationists have always been worried about, but nervous to talk about. So I think we're going into the third generation, if you like, the Colin Shears, Michael Dryhurst, pioneers of preservation in the late 1950s, have, in the main, with some exceptions, passed the preservation scene on to their successors. And we're now seeing a situation where hopefully newer people are coming in. But the interests for those people are perhaps slightly different to the ones that have caused us to try and save vehicles. And I think in some parts of the country, habitual use of buses in our everyday lives is not what it once was. We've got the relatability of the older vehicles becoming an issue now. People can't necessarily remember them, and so perhaps will relate more to something from their generation than the ones that have been saved before them. We've also got environmental pressures and potential legislative issues that might thwart our using the vehicles in the future. Storage, is a huge problem, not just in terms of cost, but actually finding it, the security of it. And we've got more competition for resources as that national collection gets bigger. Parts and materials, I've mentioned Conjuring from thin air. In some ways it's easier to find things, in other ways it's not, because the things are actually getting more and more scarce. And James was talking about the difficulty of getting drivers. The Thames Valley and Great Western Omnibus Trust has, I think, 3 crash gearbox drivers under the age of 50, and I'm one of them. We're doing a bit of training with people to try and improve that situation, but I think nationally, the situation that we've all talked about and feared, where vehicles can't participate in events because they can't get a suitable driver, has not only arrived, but we're now feeling that situation acutely. And it feels like it's happened overnight. And also, on the other side of the coin, in preserving newer vehicles, we've got challenges that we're not familiar with. And perhaps private ownership of vehicles that are so heavily dependent on electrical components and diagnostics is not going to be as straightforward as it was for those of us at the age of 7 who were out working on low-deckers and trying to discover how they worked. And I think these challenges fall into 3 brackets. We've got people and interests, so societal changes. We've got the resources, and we've got practicalities. And once you start to think about them in those terms, you can see that perhaps there are things we could do that might help us to overcome them. It's a really big ask though, isn't it? We're talking to future generations who we're saying don't have quite as much interest to take on 10,000 preserved buses and coaches that we have loved, we have invested in time, money, love. And the result of that big ask is that inevitably things are going to change. The national collection is going to evolve, whether we like it or not, but it always has, hasn't it? It's always evolved. If you think back to the 1970s, vehicles that had been preserved in the 70s, a lot of those aren't necessarily preserved now. So evolution will happen. Vehicles will enter preservation. Vehicles will leave preservation. Organisations are going to change. Some will fall by the wayside. Some will thrive. It's ever been thus. And we can't stop it from happening. But what we can do is we can help to inform that change so that the priorities that we've got are at least heard by future generations. It's largely, I think, about understanding and providing a context in which people who aren't so interested can get hold of something that might make them interested, something that makes a vehicle relatable to them, even if they don't remember it. And I've put this in there just because having a lovely RE smiling at us will lighten the mood somewhat. I'm not sure that LH is doing much lightening of the mood. It's got a bit of a cob on, hasn't it? That sounds like doom and gloom, and I can feel the mood of the room going through the floor. So what I'd like to do is give you some light now. The National Association of Road Transport Museums is aware of these issues. We have a lot of meetings where people will start talking about these issues, but then it stops because they're difficult things for us to talk about because it feels like a huge threat to the things that we really love and believe in. But I think now we're starting to see some of these issues coming to fruition to the point that actually we need to start doing something. And the scoring and grading project that we've got is a result of partly that awareness, but also other people coming to the Preserved Bus Fraternity and saying, we've got scoring and grading systems for heritage boats, planes have got their own listing and grading system. When people come to us and ask us to fund a project, we need some kind of mechanism like that for buses as well. And the National Association of Road Transport Museums represents these 100 museums, and it's felt that they are the people to do this because they have what we think is the most definitive database on that national collection. It's a database that's contributed to not just by the 100 museums themselves and also some of the private owners that we have, but it's also fed into by the PSV circle. And NARTM has a very, very good working relationship with the PSV circle in terms of providing information on what they think survives. 60% of the UK's preserved buses belong to NARTM member organisations. FOCAB is among them. And as I say, this is a response to external bodies asking for something to be done to give a mechanism for future prioritisation. What we want to do is to provide that understanding that I mentioned. It's an overview and it's a context to the vehicles which we have preserved. It's to identify which vehicles are most significant. Now, there is the thorny bit, because what makes one vehicle more significant than another? And it's also to look in the immediate term at vehicles that we think have got this umami, if you like, this metaphysical, most significant thing about them, but which are at risk, either through security of ownership or storage or funding. This is a way of finding out which of those vehicles need some help. And it will hopefully bring us into line with the rest of the heritage movement, which are already doing this. So it's a big project, 6,000 vehicles in the NARTM collection, and then preserved vehicles which are privately owned, accounting for about 4,000 at the moment. We've got the scoring system done, and this has been done in consultation with other heritage sectors which have their own. It's very closely modelled on those, but it is specific to buses and coaches. We've got a scoring team, and William is a member of the scoring team. There's me. I don't think we've any other scorers in the room yet. But we have a scoring team of about 13 or 14 of us who are, as we speak, embarking on this enormous project to go around the country and to carry out this scoring. We've trained all the scorers, and we've got the timetable for the testing and the rollout, which is underway. So what is it? What is this scoring? It's quite complex, but it boils down to 8 fundamentals. We look at the age of the vehicle, and on a sliding scale, the older a vehicle is, the more points it will get in this category. That's partly because there are fewer vehicles the further back in time you go. But it's also an aspect of this which, of course, is going to change as the vehicle ages. Its points in this category will increase. It doesn't necessarily follow that older vehicles will get a bigger aggregate score than newer vehicles, because this is just one consideration in a matrix of 8 very complex sections. We look at how typical the vehicle was in a national context when it was built. So this is not about how many survive now. This is about whether, for example, if we could only keep 10 historic buses and coaches alive in a very extreme situation, let's hope it never comes to that. If we could only keep 10 alive, would we want 10 unique ones that represent very little in terms of design development, or would we want some typical ones in the mix to show how things were for a larger number of people? So by and large, the more typical the chassis, and the more typical the body, and the more typical the combination of chassis and body, and those 3 are taken separately, then the more the vehicle will score in that category. We're looking at step changes in design. So vehicles which represent themselves, not their type, but themselves represent some sort of major advancement in design. For example, the early Atlanteans, having the engine at the back, which enabled generations of vehicles to have rear engines, would score more highly than vehicles which perhaps don't. The interesting thing in this is that you can make a case for every vehicle having some kind of design development. So in the detail of what we look at here, it's quite strictly defined what sorts of things we're looking for. Social and operational advancements, this is the most subjective of all the categories. And it's the one that's actually given us the most headaches in testing, but I think through having a headache, you learn, don't you? And this is to do with a bus or a coach in the context of the people it's serving. So does it enable rural communities to have a bus service that they otherwise wouldn't have? That's me making a case for Bristol SU to get lots of points there, by the way, which it probably won't. Is it original and/or authentic? We all know what this vehicle is, don't we? We all know what this vehicle is. This is about whether what we're looking at represents an authentic picture of that vehicle's history. It's not about its restoration. It's not about counting rivets. It's not about making judgments on the quality of the work. It's about whether the vehicle, if you like, tells its own story well. So a vehicle which is exactly as it was when it came out of the factory in terms of the engine type it's got in it and where the engine is located, and it's got its original body, would score well. Equally, a vehicle that has been rebodied but subsequently used in passenger carrying service could also score well if it's an authentic representation of that era of its operation. This vehicle is, you could argue, pretending to be something that it isn't. And we've had all sorts of discussions about whether a replica, this is commonly referred to as a replica, is that actually a replica, or is a replica something that has been faithfully recreated? The NARTM definition for a replica would be something that has been very faithfully rebuilt or reconstructed to an original design using authentic materials. This would not, therefore, qualify. So this is less likely to score well. Prototypes and pre-production vehicles we think are worthy of a higher score. So there is an extra set of points available to them. And we now look at the uniqueness of the vehicle in preservation. And this is done on a sliding scale, and all using the NARTM database to determine whether vehicles are unique, or one of two, or one of three, or one of four, and they don't get any points in this category if there are four or more identical vehicles. And then this is put there as a balance for the nationally typical question. Do you remember we had the how typical is the pairing of the body and the chassis? This is put there for vehicles which were not necessarily nationally typical, but were nonetheless a very important part of the UK bus story by virtue of the contribution they made to a region. Now, this is difficult in itself because, of course, buses are by very definition local things. But if we consider a national collection which didn't have a Midland Red D9 in it, for example, there's an important part of the national story there represented in something that is regional. So this is, if you like, a balancing question. There's a lot to take in there, and that's a very distilled version of quite a complex system. I think William will testify that there's an awful lot of considerations when you're looking at doing the scores. But what we have to remember is that this really is about identifying, if you like, the top 10% of the national collection, so that those top 10%, if they ever get into trouble, if their owners can't look after them, a case could be made for external funding. And we also collect data to do with how secure the storage is, how secure the ownership is. We saw with my green SU, it doesn't take long. The condition and status of the vehicle, and again, this isn't about making judgments on how well it's being kept. It's really about whether it's roadworthy or not, so that we've got a record of that. Whether the vehicle is currently at risk and in need of immediate help. And then star quality is loosely defined as, does the vehicle have a significance to the public, or could it be deemed to have a significance to the public that the numerical criteria that we've just been through don't really reflect? So does it have some sort of claim to fame? Does it, is it the RT in Summer Holiday, for example, or one of when there are about 3 or 4 RTs in Summer Holiday? But it's about whether there's something that hasn't been covered, and that isn't given a numerical score. That is given a note. It's important to say with all of these, alongside the numerical scores, this is a note-taking exercise. This is about record keeping. This is about working collaboratively with the owners to try and determine what needs to be recorded for future generations to be able to understand these vehicles. It's not a competition. That's a very important point. A lot of people have said this introduces competition. We're not talking about owners. We're talking about the vehicles. And we're talking about giving people the opportunity in the future to prioritise based on facts. And therefore, by definition, we're not threatening any vehicles. For as long as a vehicle is owned by somebody who is willing to fund it, that's wonderful. The problem, of course, arises when a really significant vehicle in the national story is facing a threat that requires some sort of intervention. And I'm going to play you just a clip from the bus inspectors, from Leon Daniels, who is chairman of the London Bus Museum. And I think this makes the case for all the things we've just talked about and why this scoring and grading is necessary at this point in time.
We can't assume that all the people that follow us will be as interested as we are. Preservation will have to face this, and I think if we look at this with a cold flannel on our heads, we will realise that some of these vehicles cannot carry on in perpetuity. Not everything is going to be able to be saved. That's why I think the NATM grading scheme is so hugely important, because the first time it's lifting the lid off something none of us have dared talk about so far. I think we have to accept from the definitive list of vehicles, there are quite a lot of vehicles which are similar to each other. And in the future, storage space, skills, money, we may not be able to have as many of these vehicles as we would like. Last time we checked, of the 25 private hire RFs that were built for London Transport in 1951, in preservation there were 8. I have to ask you, given the world we live in, how many private hire RFs does the world need? And I'd argue the answer is at least 1 and possibly 2. There just won't be the space, or the facilities, or the materials, or the skills, or the money to keep them all going. The NATM scheme helps to give us some sense of scale and proportion. Whenever, for example, you're applying for external funding, like with the Heritage Lottery Fund, but any funding, you're always limited as to how much you can say. They want 200 words maximum. And to try and prove the value to the community and the world at large for this particular piece of funding, for this particular vehicle, is very hard to do in 200 words. Now just imagine there's a definitive list of all of these vehicles, and they've been graded on that very basis. Graded on their part in the story, to what extent they're unique, the particular period of history that is important. Let's pretend all that work was done. Now, instead of trying to persuade any external funder that your project is a worthwhile one, now you only have to say, this is where we are in the NATM list of vehicles. We now only need to use 10 of our 200 words to demonstrate the value to the community and the world at large, and we can use the other 190 words to say something more to make the case compelling. We know that our vehicle here, RT1, is incredibly important in transport history. Most of the visitors here, it's just an RT, it's just a red half-cab bus of the period. There are lots of RTs preserved, many of them demonstrating the slight differences between the different bodybuilders, the Leylands and of course as well as the AECs, all the different variations of the RT family. And of course, as many of them that tell that story and have a particular value should be preserved, and that's why they will deserve a higher score. Many of them, I'm afraid, are just identical to others that exist of the period, and by definition they won't get such a high score because they're not under threat, they're not unique. They might be typical, but there's lots of typical ones around. I know people will say absolutely everything should be preserved at all costs, but frankly it's not going to be possible in the future. This grading system that you've got underway, I think very bravely starts to push out to say, but out there in the big wide world, not everything is going to be able to be saved.
Hear more from Leon Daniels on the Bus Inspectors podcast. Available now at thebusinspectors.com.
The Bus Inspectors in tandem is a project that we're running to try and follow this grading thing, because of course if we're visiting 100 different organisations, we want to be able to tell their stories to the public and to promote them. James was saying about the great work that Alex has been doing in putting together films for FOCAB, which really get the message out to people who don't already have an established interest in buses. I personally really believe that is where the fertile ground lies for getting future generations interested in this. I went to a Heritage Compass course on young people in heritage, and they had a girl there who I think was about 21, and she was a trustee of a heritage organisation which was to do with buildings, actually. And she said the common thing for people in this room who are frustrated about not being able to get young people into heritage is that they are looking for people who have an established deep interest that matches their own. And she said they are very few and far between. What we need to be looking at are people who have other allied interests or skills that they might like to use, who we can bring in, and they might then start developing the deeper interests that we're hoping they will show. An extreme example, this, but she got involved in her organisation when she was 17 because they offered people shopping vouchers at their open day. So that's how she got involved, and she's now a trustee. So I'm not suggesting that we start encouraging people to go shopping, but it's an example of how it draws people in on their terms rather than ours, which is perhaps what we more typically do in the preservation movement. The bus inspectors is to try and encourage people to find the joys of our hobby. So we're talking about getting this scoring and grading tour out there to them so that we can tell the stories of the vehicles to them. We've got a website for the bus inspectors. We've got all the social media channels. I'm just going to canter through this because I'll give you something to take away that has got all of this on there. But you can see it's quite a whizzy, contemporary website with everything you need to understand the project and why we're doing it. We've got a podcast, which is now up to episode 3.
Previously on the Bus Inspectors podcast, the nation's historic fleet of 10,000 vintage buses and coaches. Why we love vintage buses.
Buses and coaches aren't just a static object.
You're sitting up there, you're route master, master of the road.
There's your interaction with the conductor.
People remember the colours of the buses if they're old enough, to remember what they were like in the 60s and 70s.
Not to mention the fantastic view that you can get from inside the bus as you travel along.
The changing priorities of the generations when it comes to heritage.
So this bus is a 2000 model, which makes it 24 this year. I am 4 years younger than the bus.
The old story is, of course, I remember going to school on that. Well, they didn't go to school on AEC Rodeos. They went to school on darts and Olympians and things.
These buses need to be preserved because they are what we are going to remember in 50 years' time,
And how the Bus Inspectors project to grade the nation's historic fleet could help us in the future.
If I have some worries about the future, is that we won't be able to save everything.
We want to be able to show the way they have evolved mechanically, operationally, and indeed how they've evolved within a social context to meet the needs of the passengers that they carry.
Working out which ones most deserve to be in collections for the future is a really sensible thing to do.
Previously on the Bus Inspectors podcast.
They turned to me one day and said, "We're buying a bus."
The pioneers of preservation, who rescued many of the vintage buses we treasure today.
He decided that he had to buy one of these buses when he left school. Exeter Corporation would not sell to private individuals. Dad managed to find out who had bought the 6, and he had to meet somebody down a back street in Exeter and then purchase it off of them.
Where do you keep a vintage bus?
Storage is the bus preservationist's biggest problem.
Winkley was used for a pig store, actually. The shed was back in 1965.
These pioneers remortgaged their houses in order to provide a safe home for the vehicle.
And the Bus Inspectors took us on their travels on a mission to grade the nation's historic fleet.
Whenever you're applying for external funding, now you only have to say, this is where we are, in the NATM list of vehicles that have been graded on their part in the story, to what extent they're unique,
working out which ones are special and why, and then making some effort to make sure they are the ones that live into the 5th and 6th decades of the 21st century. I think that's probably a really sensible thing to do, isn't it?
Google the Bus Inspectors podcast, it will come up. And we've also got a fledgling YouTube channel as well, which has got a lot of video content that goes with it. And you might have seen us in the magazines as well. What I have to give you to take away, we've got some postcards, which are courtesy of the National Association of Road Transport Museums. I'm going to ask you all to take 3. One for yourselves, because it has all the address of how you can listen to the podcast and read up on the project. And the other 2, I'd like you to pop a stamp on them. The other 2, I'd like you to send one to somebody who is deeply interested in buses and therefore might be interested in the project. And the other one, I'd like you to send it to somebody who isn't necessarily interested in vintage buses and coaches, but maybe they are interesting people and therefore interested in new things. So if you're able to do that, I think in some small way, if we all do that, it will do something to try and broaden the appeal of this lovely hobby that we have, that we hope will be passed on to future generations, along with the legacy of the vehicles and all that they represent, so that future generations have got the opportunity to enjoy them in the way that we do at the moment. Does anybody have any questions on this or Hanson Dorset low deckers? Anyway, I'll leave these at the front. I won't leave my fleet number plate at the front, but I'll leave these at the front, and you're very welcome to take as many of them as you like on the way out. But I would just like to say again, thank you very much for listening and for inviting me to come and speak to you, because this outfit is very dear to me, and it's weird to be in Winchester without a bus. I was saying to James, it's the first time I've ever driven into St Cross Road and not had to take the corner wide. So a very unusual experience to be here without an FLF, but I hope that I'll be here with an FLF to see you again very soon. So thank you very much.